I can't tell her. I shouldn't. And even though I shall soon die, I will never speak of the horrible things I had seen during my stay at the Rue Aussay, and of that most strange musician, Erich Zann. I have examined maps of the countryside with the greatest care, yet have never again found the Rue d'Aussay. These maps have not been modern maps alone, for I know names change. I have, on the contrary, delved deeply into all the antiquities of the place, and have personally explored every region of whatever name which could possibly answer to the village I knew as the Rue d'Aussay. But despite all I have done, it remains a humiliating fact that I cannot find the house, the village, or even the locality where during the last months of my impoverished life as a student of metaphysics at the university, I heard the music of Erich Zann. On that night and every night thereafter, I heard the music of Erich Zann in the lonely hours of the night, and although he kept me awake, I was haunted by the weirdness of his music. Knowing little of the art myself, I was yet certain that none of his harmonies had any relation to the music I had heard before, and concluded that he was a composer of highly original genius. The longer I listened, the more I was fascinated, until, after a week, I resolved to make the old man's acquaintance. Erich Zann enters the house and begins to close the front door behind him. As Daniel watches from the dining room table, Zann quickly moves up the stairs, his face hidden by his clothing. Daniel leaps up from the table and follows Erich Zann up the stairs. Zann continues to shuffle up the stairs as Daniel follows, and then Zann suddenly stops at the landing of the second floor. Daniel stops midway up the stairs in fright. Daniel grips the railing in fear as Erich Zann slowly turns. Zann stares down at Daniel with eyes aflame with hate. And after several tense seconds, Daniel croaks a few words. I love your music. It's quite beautiful. Erich Zann continues to stare, then motions for Daniel to follow with his long, bony fingers. Erich sat for some time, inactive, his violin and bow lying carelessly on the floor beside him. He sat motionless, nodding oddly, but having a paradoxical suggestion of intense and frightened listening. Subsequently, he seemed to be satisfied, and crossing to a chair by the table, wrote a brief note, handed it to me, and returned to the table, where he began to write rapidly and incessantly. The note implored me in the name of mercy, and for the sake of my own curiosity, to wait where I was, while he prepared a full account in German of all the marvels and terrors which beset him. I waited, and the dumb man's pencil flew. And without saying a word, he began to play. He did not employ the music rack, but, offering no choice and playing from memory, enchanted me for several hours with strains I had never heard of before, strains which must have been of his own devising. To describe their exact nature is impossible for someone not versed in music. They were a kind of fugue with recurrent passages of the most captivating quality, but to me were notable for the absence of any of the weird notes I had overheard from my room below on other occasions. The note which he finally handed me was an appeal for tolerance and forgiveness. Zann said that he was old, lonely, mute, and afflicted with strange fears and nervous disorders connected with his music, and wished that I would come again and not mind his eccentricities. But he could not play another of his weird harmonies, and could not bear hearing them from another, nor could he bear having anything in his room touched by another. He had not known until our conversation that I could overhear his playing in my room, and now asked me if I would arrange with Miss Blandoe to take a lower room where I could not hear him in the night. He would, he wrote, defray the differences in rent. He did not ask me to call on him, and when I did call, he appeared uneasy and played listlessly. This was always at night. In the day he slept and would admit no one. My liking for him did not grow, though the open window and the weird music seemed to hold an odd fascination for me. I had a curious desire to look out of that window, over the woods, and down into the valley outspread there. Once I went up to his room while he was away, but the door was locked. What I did succeed in doing was to overhear the nocturnal playing of the old man. At first, I would tiptoe out of my room and stand at the bottom of the stairs and listen to his playing. Then, I soon grew bold enough to climb the creaking staircase to the top floor. There, in the narrow hall, outside the bolted door with the covered keyhole, I often heard sounds which filled me with an indefinable dread. The dread of vague wonder and brooding mystery. It was not that the sounds were hideous, for they were not, but that they held vibrations suggesting nothing on this globe of earth, and that at certain intervals they assumed a symphonic quality which I could hardly conceive as produced by one player. Certainly, Erich Zann was a genius of wild power. As the weeks passed, the playing grew wilder, whilst the old musician acquired an increasing haggardness and furtiveness pitiful to behold. He now refused to admit me at any time, and shunned me whenever we met on the stairs. Then one night, as I listened at the door, I heard the shrieking violin swell into a chaotic babble of sound, a pandemonium which would have led me to doubt my own shaking sanity had there not come from behind that barred portal a piteous proof that the horror was real. An awful, inarticulate cry which only a mute can utter, and which rises only in moments of the most terrible fear. It was perhaps an hour later, while I still waited, and while the old musician's written sheets still continued to pile up, that I saw Zann start as if from the hint of a horrible shock and anguish. Unmistakably, he was looking at the curtained window and listening shudderingly. Then, I half fancied I heard a sound myself, although not a horrible sound, but rather an exquisitely low and infinitely distant musical note, suggesting a player in one of the neighboring villages or in some distant and impenetrable part of the forest which I had never been able to see. Upon Zann, the effect was terrible. It would be useless to describe the playing of Erich Zann on that dreadful night. It was more horrible than anything I had overheard, because now I could see the expression of his face, and could realize that this time the motive was stark fear. He was trying to make a noise, to ward something off or drown something out. What? I could not imagine. In his frenzied strains, I could almost see shadowy satyrs and bacchanals dancing and whirling insanely through the seething abyss of clouds, smoke, and lightning. And then I thought I heard a shriller, steadier note that was not from the violin. A calm, deliberate, purposeful, mocking note from far away in the west. Zann's screaming violin now outdid itself, emitting sounds I had never thought a violin could emit. The shutter rattled louder, unfastened, and commenced slamming against the window. Suddenly, the window was thrown open, and the chill wind rushed in, making the candles sputter and rustling the sheets of paper on the table where Zann had begun to write out his horrible secret. I followed the flying sheets in desperation, but they were gone before I reached the open window, the only window in the Rue d'Orsay which one might see above the vast wilderness. It was very dark, but the surrounding village's lights always burned, and I expected to see them there amidst the rain and wind, yet when I looked from that highest of windows, looked while the candles sputtered and the insane violin howled with the night wind, I saw no glimmering villages, no friendly lights gleamed from across the trees, but only the blackness of space, unlimited, unimagined space, alive with motion and music, and having no semblance of anything on earth. And as I stood there in terror, the wind blew out the candles in that ancient room, leaving me in savage and impenetrable darkness with chaos and pandemonium before me, and the demon madness of that night-baying violin behind me. I crawled along the floor in the dark, without the means of striking a light, crashing against the table, overturning a chair, and finally groping my way to the place where the blackness screamed with shocking music. To save myself and Erich Zann, I could at least try, whatever the powers that opposed me. Once I thought some chill thing brushed me and I screamed, but my scream could not be heard above that hideous violin. Suddenly, out of the darkness, the madly sawing bow struck me, and I knew I was close to the player. I felt ahead, touched the back of Zann's chair, and then found and shook his shoulder in an effort to bring him to his senses. He did not respond, and still the violin shrieked on without slackening. I shouted in his ear that we must both flee from the unknown things of the night, but neither he answered me nor abated the frenzy of his unutterable music, while all through the room strange currents of wind seemed to dance in the darkness and babble. When my hand touched his ear, I shuddered, though I knew not why, until I felt the still face, the ice-cold, stiffened, unbreathing face whose glassy eyes bulged uselessly into the void. And then, by some miracle, finding the door and the large wooden bolt, I plunged wildly away from that glassy-eyed thing in the dark, and from that ghoulish howling of that accursed violin whose fury increased even as I fled. Despite my most careful searches and investigations, I have never since been able to find the Rue d'Orsay. But I'm not wholly sorry, either for this or for the loss and undreamable abyss of the closely written sheets which alone could have explained the music of Erich Zann.